Hello and welcome to the Occult Book Review. This week's book is The Coelbren Alphabet, The Forgotten Oracle of the Welsh Bards, and it's by John Michael Greer. I don't think I'd need to give too much of an introduction about Greer to people who watch these videos. Needless to say, he's an author who has written many books on ecology, the environment, paganism, and the occult. So this book was going to be an interesting one to read, in that he was actually trying to bring knowledge of a system that's been largely forgotten, I think, in occult circles. So he would have to try to, I won't say simplify, but at least be very clear, and to understand that a lot of his audience and potential readers wouldn't really know too much about the subject. So what is the Coelbren alphabet? Well, it's, as the title says, it's an oracle of sorts, but it's quite unique in that, although it's compared to runes and sometimes compared to the Irish Ogham alphabet, it's different because the meaning of the letters in the Coelbren comes from the sounds they represent. And this whole subject of sound symbolism is explored in the book, and it's something that everyone interested in the occult should have some knowledge about, I think, going back to when I suppose Plato was the most famous classical writer who discusses it. But the idea that sounds represent some kind of primal form, I suppose you can link that to spells and to sigils in a way, and also to bardic poetry, which is what the supposed rediscoverer of the Coelbren was all about initially. He was a guy called Iolo Morganwg. I may be pronouncing that wrong, but Iolo's story is very interesting, and it also brings up a lot of features that I think people interested in magic, folklore, and the occult will find well worth exploring, because there's a lot of issues about the Coelbren. I'd have to say, for most scholars, it's not an authentic alphabet, and Greer goes into this in the book. And again, it's another avenue well worth thinking about, that difference between what is authentic and what is valid. Because although we interchange those two words quite a lot, they actually mean different things. So authentic meaning, very simply, a truth about what something is, and then valid is whether or not something actually does what it's supposed to. So, for example, the idea of tarot for some people is not authentic, as kind of signified by cards, although they may say, but the symbols mean something. So tarot is valid, but as if you believe that it's a set of symbols from Egypt, a lot of people will disagree with you, and they'll say that's not authentic. So I've kind of gone off on a tangent here, but anyway, it's a good argument to have with people, and I think you kind of come away with information that maybe you may not have even thought about before. And that also is another avenue that comes about from reading this book, because Greer talks about the idea of divination. And why divination actually worked in a lot of circumstances was because it would be random. And so, for example, if you're a hunter-gatherer society and you wanted to go through parts of the forest, you would consult maybe the shaman or the diviner, and they may have picked out a part of the forest that was completely random for you as well. So if you didn't know about it, then the animals you wanted to hunt certainly didn't know about it. And it meant that you didn't kind of use up all your resources. So that kind of randomness was actually creating a way forward, if you like. The first section of the book gives us a history of Iolo Morganwg and the type of character he was. He was a very enthusiastic man, and a man who was responsible almost single-handedly for that whole Welsh revival of kind of the bardic and Celtic and pagan tradition that came about from the 18th and 19th centuries onwards. There are a lot of issues with Iolo, because he did forge a lot of manuscripts, and he'd done this out of a sense of I was going to say loyalty to his place and to his history. I'm not sure whether John Michael Greer would agree with that, but that's kind of the feeling I got. But from Iolo's forgery, something very interesting seemed to happen. He would forge a poem and say it was from a certain bard, and the experts who had read this bard for all of their lives and knew his work inside out would say that Iolo's forged poetry was the best work of this bard. And okay, first of all, that says that Iolo was a brilliant writer, and he was able to delve into the kind of mindset and the point of view of the people he was forging. But it also meant that he had huge knowledge, and he was able to elaborate on the mythology and the kind of subject matter that each individual bard would write about. Now, what also happened with Iolo was that, as well as forging, he went around Wales and he was going into people's attics and into kind of personal libraries and so on. He was finding manuscripts that hadn't been read for hundreds of years, and this was the basis for a lot of his forged work and his later kind of Welsh Druidic revivalism. And what happened from that was that he had a huge influence on people, and this brings us into a whole philosophical area about the context of forgery and the fruits of forgery. So Greer talks about it in the book as well, and it makes you wonder, like, although Iolo did forge texts, what came from those forged texts was that other people began to explore their Welsh heritage and found texts and found poems and recipes and folklore that had been lost for generations. And this is the other complication with the Coelbren and the Bards, which is a compilation of Iolo's work, which is put together by a follower of his, which I'll talk about later on. The problem is that there is real folklore and real bardic wisdom and texts mixed in with Iolo's creations. Now, when I was reading this, I was thinking a bit about this book here and George P. Hansen's ideas in The Trickster and the Paranormal, where he talks about how forgeries and people tend to bring in untruths when it comes to the supernatural. Or does the supernatural itself create them in order to disguise itself? Or maybe that's the way it comes through. It needs the imagination. So this kind of willingness to say something that's not true, but imagine that it is true, creates this kind of wormhole to the occult or the supernatural. That's just me kind of wondering about it. But Hansen talks about it as well. I suppose there's a famous case in England of a poltergeist. And even though there was so much recorded and documented effects, the person being affected still forged and falsified some testimony about other things that weren't true. And you kind of go, was there not enough there for you to kind of be kind of secure in what you were saying? And you could make that argument with Iolo and the Coelbren and the work in the Bards as well, I think. So according to the Bards, the Coelbren has its roots in a story where there was a character called Einigan the Giant. And he was out one day and he saw 3 rays coming down representing all of the wisdom of God. And he wrote down as quickly as he could the letters that he could remember. And he got 3 branches from a rowan tree and engraved the letters of the Coelbren on them. And over time, people began to worship the branches as opposed to worshipping the wisdom that was written on them. And this caused Einigan great distress, and he died. And years later, a bard was wandering the land and came across Einigan's skull and the branches growing out of them, out of his eye sockets and so on. And he transcribed those letters down, and this was how the Coelbren was found again. Within that mythological system, you have parallels to other systems, particularly in Celtic countries, and especially later when Iolo began to kind of reflect upon, at least it seems that way in the book, he seemed to reflect upon his legacy. He became a drug addict, and he also began to go even more mystical. He began to talk about reincarnation all the time, and the ideas of the secret. There was supposedly a secret name of God, and this comes to the kind of divination aspect of the book, which I'll talk about before I finish. Anyway, Iolo's kind of take on the reincarnation system was that we had all these kind of evolutionary soul manifestations, if you want to put it like that, where we would evolve from particles of matter all the way up into insects, into animals, then into kind of humans, into the fairy realms, into spiritual realms, and so on, and higher and higher. And there are parallels, as I said, to Irish myths there. The wooing of Etain is one story that you can research and see. But I also saw parallels to T.H. White's books in the Once and Future King saga, which of course have a Welsh connection as well. Particularly the first book, the Sword in the Stone, I think it is. So that's another one actually well worth checking out. But this idea then of the secret name of God brings us to the kind of more magical aspect of the Coelbren. And one other aspect here that I think is worth mentioning is how Greer came to write this book, because he had been looking at it for a while, at the Coelbren for a while, and he kind of ran out of sources. He came to dead ends, and he wondered, like, would he ever find kind of a way forward, a way to kind of authenticate what Iolo was saying. So he was in a bookshop in the Appalachian Mountains of all places, and Greer says that he was walking through the bookshop and he was drawn to this dusty corner, and he picked up a book, and it turned out to be a book about Welsh grammar of all things. And in that book there was a reference that opened the doorway to Greer finding out the symbolic, the occult, and the divinatory meanings of the Coelbren. And I think that is something that occult researchers and writers will recognize as kind of that magical synchronicity that seems to take place. In a way, it ties down to what I had mentioned about the supernatural potentially needing a reaching outside of the everyday context in order to break through. I think that theme came up a few times actually in previous book reviews, but it seems that you do need your imagination to make that kind of first step, if you like. So that synchronicity worked for Greer, and he was able to come up with the book. The letters then they're all straight lines. And this is because they would have needed to be written down on hard surfaces. So it has that connection to Om. And in some ways, I was thinking there's a kind of connection to the I Ching there as well. Greer doesn't go into it, but it's just something that I thought about. So I've mentioned before that I think it's difficult to talk about books that deal with practice in a book review, because all that's happening here is you're getting instructions in a practice book, and you've got to do the work yourself. So you can't really review something like that. But there are sections in the book then that kind of go through the Coelbren alphabet. Greer uses the 24-letter version, and he gives exercises first on connecting that each letter to the sound it makes, and that's important. I mentioned that at the start of the review, and at the end of the book, Greer talks about that. He talks about the idea that maybe sounds represent original forms, and it's a kind of Platonic idea, and there are different schools of thought on that. He talks about using the letters for scrying, for meditation. He gives, I suppose, if you want to make an equivalent, you could say he gives the equivalent of tarot spreads using these letters. You use it in a completely different way, though. And he talks about the Coelbren, and again, whether or not it's authentic or whether it's valid, it depends really on how you use it. So at the end of the book, what you'll find is it's a way in. You really have to do a lot of work to kind of follow the Coelbren. First of all, you're most likely going to be speaking in a different language than you're used to, unless, of course, you speak Welsh yourself. And apart from that, it's a matter of, there's a lot of imaginative exercises in the book as well, which leads you to kind of get to know the letters and to meditate upon them and to understand that idea of sound representing form again. So the book is by John Michael Greer. It's published by Llewellyn, and it's a very interesting book. It's a history, and it's a history of a character as well as a system, and also it's a practical workbook as well. So I recommend this for people interested in the Coelbren, and if people want to draw parallels between runes and Ogham, and, as I said, maybe the I Ching. So see you next week. Thanks for watching.